It's the show where Hawaii's newsmakers come to talk and to take your questions live. From the nation's capital to Honolulu Hale, from the state legislature to the fifth floor. We bring the experts to you and ask them what you want to know. Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Pillay-Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs.
Well, thanks for joining us on this busy Monday morning. We're coming online as Governor Green delivers his first State of the State address. But the show goes on here on Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Ryan Pillay-Suji, joined by Yanji Denise. We're actually going to be catching up with Governor Green next week to hear more about his speech. But today, we are focusing on climate change.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we understand the governor has campaigned on. It's something that he says is a priority for his administration. We are feeling the effects of climate change day in and day out here in the islands. And to bring us up to speed as to where we are on a global level and how it's affecting us right here at home, we've invited Dr. Chip Fletcher. He, of course, is the Interim Dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at Mānoa. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Yanji. Thank you, Ryan.
So we have a number of slides that we want to talk to you about. You've brought some great information to share with our viewers this morning. Let's dive right in. Bottom line, how are we doing?
Well, we are actually in the midst of a true transformation globally in our energy system. But let's take a look at the warming that's taking place thus far. So the first slide here is data from NASA that shows the annual average temperature on Earth's surface, including the surface waters of the ocean. You see that since the mid-1970s, there's been a strong upward tick in warming. That red box represents last year, 2022. It's coming in as the fourth to sixth warmest year on record. And the last 8 years have been the warmest in the last several centuries of Earth history. Global warming so far has reached between 1.1 and 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial period. And while that may not seem like a very large number, in Fahrenheit, it's between 2 and 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's analogous to having a low-grade fever in your body. Our metabolism is very sensitive to small changes in temperature, and it turns out that Earth's surface is also very sensitive to small changes in temperature. And so even a small amount of warming like this causes very dramatic changes in the ecosystems and the physical processes that bring us our climate. Let's look at the next slide. So the United Nations has been organizing annual meetings among the world's nations, and in 2015 got every nation to agree to ratchet down their greenhouse gas emissions in order to stop warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And on this plot, this very busy plot, on the vertical axis, we have CO2 emissions globally in gigatons or billions of tons. And on the bottom axis, we have time from 2010 to 2050. You can see the black line here, which I've labeled historic CO2 emissions. The year 2020, we saw a 5.4% drop in global CO2 emissions. This was related to the COVID recession. But then in 2021, CO2 emissions rose again to a new record. They rose 5.7%. And last year, the final numbers aren't in yet, but in 2022, the estimates are that it rose an additional 1%. So it does seem as if coming out of the recession, the COVID recession, CO2 emissions are on the rise again. This is going in the wrong direction. To reduce global warming, we have to reduce our emissions, and that green line shows you the pathway we need to follow so that we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions globally by 2050 in order to stop warming before reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, under that meeting in 2015 with the United Nations, all of the world's countries announced promises called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, to lower their emissions. And when you add those promises up, you get the yellow line. The yellow line puts us on a pathway of warming of between 2.4 and 2.6 degrees Celsius. This is a very dangerous level of warming. But even worse is that when you look at the actual policies and investments of the world's nations, they actually add up to this blue line. Actual policies take us up to an average of 2.8 degrees of warming by the end of the century. All of the 2.8 degrees would be by the end of the century. Now, this represents a gap, and every year the United Nations comes out with what's known as the Gap Report, and there's a picture of the latest report called the Closing Window. And this report tells us that the latest science models by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicate that emissions need to be cut by 45% by the end of this decade. And yet current commitments in burning fossil fuels for energy will increase emissions by over 10% by 2030. So we're clearly going in the wrong direction. So that's a summary of the global warming situation. Let's look at the next slide, actually. There's a third slide here. And in red, so what we have here on the bottom axis is a short history from 1850 up to 2021. Everything in the hot colors, the red or pink, represents the release of carbon dioxide and fossil fuels of other types into the air. The stuff in blue you can ignore. That's basically where nature absorbs these gases, such as into the ocean and in forests. And averaged over the period of the 1960s up to about the year 2010, you can see that historic emissions rose at about 3% per year. But then since 2010, the emissions averaged much less. They rose at about 0.5% per year. So this represents a long-term plateau in global greenhouse gas emissions. It does indicate that we're in a transformational period. It's related to the rapid decrease in the cost of solar power, wind power, and hydropower. And what we need to see next is, as we get towards 2030, we need to see negative emissions per year taking place. So there's a transition taking place, and that's the last slide about global warming. There is a global transition taking place. I'm very optimistic about it. However, it would have been better if it happened 20 years ago. We're a little bit late, and there's still some problems related to that.
You know, one of the things, of course, that we are seeing the direct effect of is this ocean level and the sea level rise. This coming off of a historic weekend on the North Shore with the Eddie ICAL Big Wave Tournament that was held. But we also saw a number of homes, once again, that were severely impacted by these large waves and these swells. But overall, we continue to see an increase in the sea level rise. I'm wondering if we could spend some time talking about what's driving this global sea level rise overall.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at the next image here. So global sea level rise is principally driven. The number one component of global sea level rise is that the oceans are absorbing heat from the air. So this map tells us that the land, the continents, are warming faster than the global average, and that the oceans are still cooler than the global average temperature. And as the oceans absorb heat from the air, they thermally expand. So this thermal expansion actually represents about 38% of global sea level rise. And what's interesting about this, and very tragic, unfortunately, is that the oceans will take over 1,000 years to absorb the heat that we have already put into the air. We are continuing to burn greenhouse gas emissions. Heat in the atmosphere is continuing to accumulate. And so we're looking at least 1,000 years of continuing sea level rise simply from the thermal expansion taking place by the world's oceans. Let's look at the next slide. In addition to the oceans absorbing heat, the world's cryosphere, or the ice around the planet, is melting. And Greenland is contributing about 20% of global sea level rise as it loses ice. Next slide. Antarctica is also losing ice, and it's contributing about 9% of global sea level rise. And you'll see that very dark region. This is West Antarctica. There are a set of glaciers there that are accelerating into the ocean, and they represent one of the big uncertainties in future sea level rise. If these glaciers or ice streams accelerate catastrophically into the ocean, we could be looking at 6 to 7 or 8 feet of sea level rise at the turn of the century. However, if they continue at their current rate, if they do not strongly accelerate beyond their present rate of melting, then we're looking at more 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise at the end of the century. So the sort of nature of future catastrophic sea level rise really hinges on what's going to happen in these glaciers in West Antarctica. And so a lot of science is focusing on this area. Next slide. What a lot of people don't realize is that during the 20th century, humanity was busy damming most of the world's rivers, and that actually mitigated global sea level rise. So in the second half of the 20th century, global sea level rise slowed down a little bit because we were trapping water in reservoirs. Well, now we have dammed all the world's major rivers, and as we pull more water out of aquifer systems on the continents and use that water to irrigate our food crops, that water then flows back into the ocean, and it represents about 10% of global sea level rise. That is, we're mining water from continental aquifers, using it, and then it flows into the ocean, causing the ocean to rise. Next slide. So that is, well, yeah, we can take a little break there. That is
sorry.
interesting aspect is that we're partially responsible for sea level rise simply by irrigating our food crops with groundwater.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never even considered that, that part of the equation. But when you take the first portion of what you talked about with those rising temperatures, where we're supposed to be and where we're actually at, it seems like no matter what we do, this is already here. This is an inevitability. It's not a matter of how much, sea level rise or not, it's how much. So given that, what are some of the adaptations and what can we expect in the coming years? As a homeowner, it makes me nervous to think, okay, well, how much longer can we live here, given also that our economic core is so centered on the shorelines of our state? So, how do we plan for this and how do we adapt?
So those are great questions, Yunji. And county agencies, state agencies, and federal agencies are working hard on these questions. There are many different coastal communities. Just in Hawaii, we have beachfront communities, we have urban communities, we have places where we have actually filled former wetlands and built hotels on them. This is Waikiki. The beach in Waikiki is largely an engineering construct at this point. We have other areas such as Kaka'ako, where we have done a lot of development. And the question is, what is the nature of sea level rise flooding in the future in these areas, and how can we adapt to it? I have a couple of images where we can walk through the different types of flooding that occurs. And with each type, you would adapt in a different way. But first, let's take a look at this tool or this image, which comes to us from a new report that came out in early 2022 from a federal task force involving NOAA, NASA, the Department of Interior, the Army Corps of Engineers, and they have provided they've provided coastal communities around the US with planning scenarios. And the planning scenario that they provide for Honolulu suggests that if you're going to be planning a project that can tolerate some flooding, you should design it for 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. If you're going to be planning a project that cannot tolerate the risk of flooding, you should design it for what's known as the intermediate high scenario, which is almost 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So these scenarios have been made available for every tide gauge in the United States. And we have scenarios for tide gauges on Kauai, Maui, the Big Island as well as Oahu. And the City and County of Honolulu Climate Change Commission has updated its guidance for sea level rise planning on the basis of this report. Let's look at the next slide. We all know that sea level rise increases flooding by high waves and from coastal erosion. So this is a problem that we need to adapt to. If we choose to adapt to this problem by building seawalls or putting in sandbags, we're going to lose the beach, because as sea level rises, the beach needs to migrate landward. This means that the land is at risk and everything we have built on it. And so we need to make a choice. Are we going to protect individual houses or sections of road, or are we going to protect beaches? And it turns out that this decision has been made for us because beaches are a public trust. Decisions by the Hawaii State Supreme Court and also in the Constitution of the state identify that every citizen in Hawaii has a right to get to the ocean and to walk along the edge of the ocean. And as we harden our shorelines and beaches disappear, this destroys that public trust. So we need to figure out ways to, what's the exit strategy for coastal homes, such as the ones you see in this image. Let's look at another slide. Sea level rise also tends to come into our urban communities through our storm drain system. So what you're looking at here on the left is a scene in Waikiki, and on the right is a scene in Mapunapuna by the airport. These are drainage. This is a drainage system designed to take rainfall and drain it into nearby canals or into the ocean. But as the ocean rises, the salt water instead comes up those same pipes and backflows into our communities. Next slide. We also have the water table. And here is our researcher, Dr. Shelley Habel, measuring the salinity of a water table at a new construction site in Waikiki. And she's finding that that water is brackish. It's not fresh water. So this is the water table underneath the ground in Waikiki at high tide. And in this brand new construction site, it's already being flooded at high tide. And it doesn't even take rainfall to cause flooding. This is simply the rise of the water table when it's high tide in the oceans. Next slide. Back in December of 2021, we had a Kona low, which is a storm system which blew onshore onto Waikiki. There were onshore winds. It also happened to be a king tide. And so we had tremendous flooding with the high tide as well as the rainfall on Kalakaua Avenue. You can see this is a section of Kalakaua Avenue where there is a lot of shopping that takes place, and yet it's almost completely underwater during this event. This is called compound flooding. Next slide. And we can model flooding by the ocean coming over the shoreline in blue, by storm drains, backflowing salt water onto streets. With pink dots are individual storm drains, and the red lines are roads where the level of flooding is greater than 6 inches, which tends to shut down the road for traffic. And this is what our area of Waikiki and Kaka'ako will look like at 4 feet of sea level rise towards the end of the century. Very dramatic flooding at high tide, and here is 5 feet of sea level rise. So this problem needs to be adapted to. And next slide. This is the challenge. You may have watched the Eddy yesterday, the Eddy Cow Surf Contest take place yesterday. And indeed, I've been seeing photographs coming in this morning where our models of wave run-up are matching what has been observed in the last 24 hours. So this is up on the North Shore at Sunset Beach. In this case, we're looking at a little more than 3 feet of sea level rise. And you can see the waves in blue running up past the road in our model simulation here. And the red line is land loss, or basically the coastal erosion line we can expect under 3.2 feet of sea level rise.
And in that last one, we're already there. That's what you're saying.
Well, we are there with wave run-up during the eddy. So this is an extraordinarily high swell event. It's actually bigger than was projected. That image is our model projection under 3.2 feet of sea level rise happening every single year. Whereas what you're seeing yesterday and today was the eddy happening on a sort of a decade or a 20-year time frame.
You know, and just looking at some of those images, they're obviously very sobering. And to see the areas like those images of Waikiki, of a new development, and you mentioned Kaka'ako, where there continues to be a lot new development and things that have projects that have yet to even break ground. What does that future look like for those who live in areas like Waikiki? That's, of course, a strong economic driver for the state, and areas like Kaka'ako, where these developments continue to move forward. I mean, are those conversations happening with these developers, and what are you suggesting, or what are you hearing when it comes to this sea level rise?
So along the south shore of our urban area, we already have largely a hardened shoreline. So you have seawalls there already, which are doing an important job of protecting our urbanized area from sea level rise. The next thing is to consider the difference between, do we want to raise the land with fill like we did with Waikiki 100 years ago? We took the dredge from the Alawai Canal when they were carving the Alawai Canal, and we put that spoil on the wetland in Waikiki, and we raised it 2 feet. Is there fill that we could get from other locations on the island and raise Waikiki further? Now, you can't just, move the buildings aside and raise the ground and put the building back on top of it. This is an iterative process that will have to take place along with renovations and remodeling of a lot of these buildings. There may be some buildings that we have to walk away from. There might be some streets that can no longer, they need to be turned into more walkable venues rather than drivable venues. And as we remodel and renovate buildings of all types, we can make that first floor floodable. We can design it so that water can wash in and out during the high tide. And you can get easily another 30 to 50 years of use out of these buildings. But we have to keep in mind that sea level rise is inevitable. It's not going to go away, and it's going to get to very difficult to tolerate levels by the end of the century. How do we redesign these communities under 5, 6, 7 feet of sea level rise? Eventually, we'll have to just walk away from these communities, I believe.
That is very difficult for so many of us to stomach. I'm interested to know, we did note at the top that Governor Green is giving his State of the State today, and he had campaigned in part on his his stance to help to fight climate change and adapt, if you will. What are you expecting out of this administration, and what do you and others want to see this legislative session?
So personally, I'm expecting great things out of this administration. Governor Green, as you said, is a climate governor. He is well aware of the problems. He understands that it's not just about mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. That's critically important as well, but also, as you said, about adapting to these problems. And we not only have sea level rise to adapt to, we have growing heat. We are now seeing projections coming from federal agencies that this summer, perhaps as soon as this summer and over the next year, we may see the next El Nino take place. And with El Nino, we see very high sea surface temperatures, and we see high air temperatures around Hawaii. The last El Nino we had here was in 2016, 2017. Of course, the possibility of tropical cyclones has increased, as well as other hazards like drought and intense rainfall. Governor Green has promised to set aside $100 million as a climate fund. We don't have much detail on that, other than it's the first time that we've seen a governor pledge a specific amount of money for this purpose. That has to go through the legislative process. He has also pledged to create a climate office of some sort, advisory to the governor. We have yet to see what that will look like, but I'm very optimistic about this administration.
We only have a few moments left, but there are, I'm sure, many people who are watching this who wonder, what do we do? What can be done at this point in time? What can everyday people do? What is your message, I guess, for those who feel hopeless in a sense, but still want to find ways where they can try and help in their small bit to help the problems that we're discussing this morning?
Yeah, don't feel hopeless. I feel we're in the right location as we move into a future that has a lot of uncertainty. I have children born and raised in Hawaii. I have grandchildren born and being raised in Hawaii. And I'm not thinking about moving someplace else. I think Hawaii is the right place to be. We are not as hot as the continents. We certainly have our share of climate change problems, but we need to prepare for increasing isolation because it's going to grow more difficult for the southwestern states to provide us with food. We need to prepare for declining rainfall in Hawaii and spreading drought. We need to become more independent in terms of our fuels. And we need to continue on our very strong pathway of independent electricity production, energy production. So we still have a lot to do, but I think we're well along the path. We've really shown strong leadership on preparing for climate change.
I want to circle back just in the little bit of time we have left to this climate fund, this $100 million. Given the scale of this issue, what kind of an impact? I mean, that is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but still, what kind of an impact would that have, and where would you suggest that money go toward?
Oh, there's a lot of places that money can go. It can be combined with matching funds from the counties, for instance, to change urban areas where gravity-fed drainage is no longer effective. A lot of those images that I showed you are basically the failure of gravity-fed drainage. And instead, we can put pumped drainage so that when it rains, we would actually pump the water out rather than just letting gravity take it. That funding can go as incentives and subsidies to private entities such as resorts and hotels who are experiencing, who want to adapt to sea level rise, and commercial areas. So it can act as matching funds. And I think we also want to look at what has been mentioned, the green fee, the possibility of a additional fee to tourism to help pay for the wear and tear of our natural resources, but also some of the expense related to climate adaptation. And let's not forget that we are still in a lawsuit with the oil majors, with Exxon and other members of the large oil industry, and we are asking them to help us with adaptation costs as well.
All right, Dr. Chip Fletcher, thank you so much for joining us here this morning and sharing all your insights and knowledge. It always is great to have you on, very informative, and I know we, as well as our viewers, appreciate all the information provided. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good to see you. Wow, Ryan, whenever we talk to him, I'm so glad you asked him that question at the end, because you can start to feel a little overwhelmed when you think about, whether it's 3 feet or 5 feet, it's coming. And as he showed in those images, in a lot of places, it's already here. So how do we appropriately adapt? It does sound like he has a lot of faith in this current administration. We'll have to see what the governor said in his speech this morning about his commitment to climate change and that climate fund, along with an advisory person, perhaps a cabinet member is what he was suggesting, to handle climate change. We know that the city and county of Honolulu has a climate change office. Perhaps the state will follow suit.
Yeah, and we just, I think it's great to hear from him because you get a global perspective of what's happening and how those global impacts are impacting us right here in Hawaii and in the urban core of Honolulu as we look through some of those images, but also hearing from him about the past and recognizing some of the areas that are experiencing these floods. Areas like Waikiki that was actually built, was marshland once before and was built up. Just interesting to hear his thoughts about moving forward and how to navigate through that, potentially with losing some of the first levels of these buildings that we see that could be floodable, as he said, but adapting it, knowing that it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's when, and how we adapt and how we move forward into the future with some of these developments and projects, recognizing that this is something that will have to be factored in in all decision making and plans moving forward for some of the construction zones for the Urban Core of Honolulu.
Yeah, and kind of disheartening. At one point, he did say there are some projects that we'll simply have to walk away from, that, we have to sort of give the ocean back some of the land. And those are the conversations that the city and county continues to have with homeowners in certain areas. There are roadways that we know that flood year after year, and the DOT continues to build them back. Is it time to migrate some of our roads to higher ground? These are all ongoing conversations that we continue to have with leaders in our community, and we do appreciate Dr. Fletcher bringing us the science on this. On Wednesday, we are switching gears and we're going over to the Big Island to talk to the new CEO of the Kona Hospital there. They've been having some financial issues, and there are a lot of costs to running a rural hospital. Kona's not necessarily rural per se, but they do serve a lot of rural communities, such an important lifeline to so many. And so what are they going to do moving forward? What investments do they need from the state? We're going to talk about all of that with the new CEO there, Clayton McGann. So we look forward to that on Wednesday.
That's why we're also going to be catching up with some of the families impacted by Red Hill, another conversation piece that is important, followed by catching up with Governor Green next week as well. So looking forward to the future shows. We look forward to seeing you back here for another episode of Spotlight Hawaii on Wednesday. Until then, take care and aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.